Imagine you've trained for 15 years. You've survived G-force simulators, ice water survival tanks, months of isolation in underwater habitats. You are, by every scientific and psychological measure, one of the most mentally fortified humans on the planet. And then you get to space, and something happens to you that nobody, not your flight instructors, not your therapists, not NASA's entire psychological division, fully prepared you for. You look out the window, and you are never, ever the same again. Here's the thing. We talk about space travel like it's fundamentally a physical experience. The zero gravity, the radiation, the muscle atrophy. Those are real. Those are documented. But there's something else happening in the minds of the people we send up there. Something that changes how they vote, how they parent, what they believe, who they become when they come home. Scientists have a name for it. And once I tell you what it actually does to the human brain, I think you're going to look at your own life a little differently. Stay with me. In 2016, NASA made a discovery that stunned the scientific community. They had been studying twin astronauts, Scott Kelly, who spent a year aboard the International Space Station, and his identical twin brother Mark, who stayed on Earth. Same DNA, same upbringing, same baseline psychology. After Scott returned, researchers found that his gene expression had changed. 7% of his genes were behaving differently than his brothers. His telomeres, the protective caps on his DNA, the biological clock of your cells, had actually lengthened in space, which almost never happens. But that wasn't the part that fascinated me most. It was what Scott said when people asked him what space felt like. He described looking down at Earth, this fragile, luminous marble suspended in absolute black, and feeling something crack open inside his chest, something he couldn't explain with the vocabulary of a retired Air Force colonel and NASA astronaut. He said borders disappeared. He said the wars and the politics and the arguments that consume us down here looked from up there like noise. Beautiful, tragic, unnecessary noise. Scott Kelly isn't alone in this. Over 600 humans have been to space. And a startling percentage of them, across different nationalities, religions, political beliefs, come home describing the same thing. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, called it a sudden, overwhelming sense of universal connectedness. Ron Garan, a NASA astronaut, actually wept, when he saw Earth from the ISS for the first time. Rusty Schweikart described being unable to separate himself from the universe, like he had dissolved into something larger. Philosopher Frank White interviewed dozens of astronauts and gave this experience a name in 1987. He called it the overview effect. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because feeling connected to the universe sounds like something you'd find on a motivational poster in a dentist's waiting room, right? Vague, sentimental, easy to dismiss. But neuroscientists didn't dismiss it. They got curious. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, including the neuroscientist Andrew Newberg, began studying what actually happens in the brain during these profound moments of selflessness and unity, what they called self-transcendent experiences. And what they found was almost uncomfortable in how physical it was. The default mode network, the brain system responsible for your sense of self, your ego, your internal monologue, that voice that narrates your life and keeps score and worries about what people think, that network goes quiet. Not metaphorically quiet, measurably, visibly, demonstrably quiet. Think about what that means. The part of your brain that makes you feel separate from everything else, separate from other people, separate from nature, separate from the universe, temporarily steps back, and what floods in its place isn't emptiness. Astronauts describe it as clarity, as if they'd been looking at life through a dirty window their entire existence, and someone finally wiped it clean. But here's the question that kept nagging at me when I went down this rabbit hole. Why does seeing Earth from space do this? What is it about the view that rewires a human mind? The answer, I think, is deeply tied to something called the awe response. Awe is one of the most under-researched emotions in psychology, but that's changing fast. Dasher Keltner at UC Berkeley has spent decades studying it, and what he found is that awe, specifically the kind triggered by encountering something vast and incomprehensible, reliably shrinks what psychologists call the perceived self. When you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon, or watch a thunderstorm roll across a plain, or look at the Milky Way on a clear night far from city lights, something happens in your brain chemistry. Cortisol drops. The default mode network quiets. Cytokines, the inflammatory markers associated with chronic stress, decrease. You become, briefly, less obsessed with yourself. And when you are less obsessed with yourself, you become more generous, more patient, more interested in other people's suffering. The research on this is remarkably consistent. We've all had a version of this, haven't we? A moment in nature, or at a concert, or holding a newborn where time stops and the mental chatter goes silent and everything feels, for just a second, okay. Astronauts are just experiencing that at a scale we can barely imagine. 1,000 miles of atmosphere beneath their feet. The entire human story compressed into a single blue bruise of light. And here's the part that I think matters most for those of us who will never leave the atmosphere. The overview effect isn't magic. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be studied, approximated, deliberately sought. Keltner's research suggests that regular encounters with awe, intentional ones, not accidental ones, produce measurable changes in how people relate to themselves and each other over time. Astronauts get it in one violent, irreversible dose. The rest of us can find it in smaller, quieter ways. But the effect is real. The brain changes. It is not fixed. It is not finished. Scott Kelly came home and became an advocate for climate policy. Edgar Mitchell founded an institute to study consciousness. Ron Garan wrote a book called The Orbital Perspective and dedicated his post-NASA life to humanitarian work. These aren't coincidences. This is the overview effect completing its work. So here's what I keep thinking about. We spend enormous energy trying to fix the outside of our lives. The job, the relationship, the bank account. And those things matter. I'm not dismissing them. But what astronauts seem to discover, involuntarily, irreversibly, at 17,500 miles per hour above the Earth, is that the inside was always the leverage point. The way you see yourself in relation to everything else, that single perception, shapes nearly every choice you make. And the profound, almost uncomfortable truth of the overview effect is this. You don't need to go to space to see more clearly. You just need to find, as often as you can, something larger than yourself. Something that makes the voice in your head go quiet. Something that reminds you that you are part of something rather than separate from it. The astronauts didn't come back changed because they went somewhere extraordinary. They came back changed because they saw something they'd never let themselves see before. Maybe the question worth sitting with tonight isn't what you want. Maybe it's, what would you want if your sense of self got a little quieter? Think about that. Subscribe to the channel. Every week, we publish fascinating videos about everything imaginable, from hidden mysteries and shocking discoveries to stories that will completely change the way you see the world. Don't miss the next one.